The last thing we're going to talk about today takes us away from chemistry just a little bit and into the science of physics. Now, this involves the first law of thermodynamics and the concept of energy. We're going to talk about energy quite a bit as we move through the rest of the term. I just want to introduce it today, and I want to connect it again to the first law. The first law of thermodynamics, which is also called the law of conservation of energy, tells us that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only altered in its form. So we cannot simply create energy out of thin air. We also cannot destroy energy. All we can do as living things is change the form that energy takes. Now again, we haven't talked about energy in any kind of detail, but for now, I just want you to remember that all living cells require energy. All living cells need a constant source of energy in order to survive. We've talked today about biochemistry and we've talked about electrons. Electrons are actually the conduits of energy inside living cells. Now, that word conduit, that means sort of the source of, the carriers of energy inside cells. So this is what I mean when I say that of the atomic particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, when it comes to biology, it's the electron that really interests us. Because the electron, again, is this carrier, this conduit of energy in the cell. From a biological perspective, the first law of thermodynamics is telling us something about energy inside of cells. We can't create it, we can't destroy it. All we can do is alter it in its form. Now, we've been talking about covalent bonds. We talked about what a covalent bond is. It's a pair of electrons that are being shared between two atoms. Those electrons are energy conduits. They're involved in the use of energy in a cell. So when they're sitting inside a covalent bond, we say that the energy associated with those electrons is being stored. You may have heard of the term potential energy. That is another way of saying stored energy. Those electrons are sitting in a bond between two atoms right now. They're not moving. They're not free. They are literally sitting between two atoms in that moment. So the energy that's associated with those two electrons is being stored in that bond. If the cell were to break that bond between those two atoms, those electrons would be released and they would move and they would take energy with them as they go. Now, when electrons become released from covalent bonds, the energy that they take with them can be transformed. It can be put into another type, another form of energy. Now, one of the most obvious is to simply put them back into a covalent bond, right? If we're going to break a bond between two atoms, one of the most logical things to do next is to build a new bond and harness, if you will, store those electrons in that new bond. So when it comes to molecules being built and broken inside a living cell, every time a new bond is built, energy is stored in that bond. Every time an old bond is broken, energy is released from that bond. Now, when it comes to building and breaking bonds, the form of energy that we're talking about there is chemical energy. There are other forms that energy can take in a cell. There's what we refer to as mechanical energy, and that is simply the energy of motion. The other term you will hear is kinetic energy, the energy of movement, in other words. Another form of energy is electrical. Of course, it's electrical energy that helps our nervous system run and our skeletal muscles function. So, energy can be stored in a cell for later use, or energy can be released and transformed from one type to another, from chemical to mechanical or kinetic to electrical, different forms of energy. The energy is not being destroyed, it's simply being altered in its form. The last thing I'll mention today is the concept that sometimes a cell loses energy. It's not destroying the energy, but it loses it sort of to the outside world. It loses it to the universe. And when it comes to living cells, the most common way that energy is lost from a cell is through the form of heat, or what we would call thermal energy. When a living cell breaks bonds but does nothing to transform that energy is frequently lost as heat. Once it's lost, it's lost. That cell doesn't have that energy anymore. So cells work very hard to conserve energy. They're very stingy, they're very miserly with energy, and they will work hard to keep energy either in a usable form for them in that moment, or to store it away for when they might need it at another time. Again, we'll be talking quite a bit about this subject of energy as we go through the term. I just wanted to introduce it today since we are talking about covalent bonds and biochemistry.